Good morning. Christianity's relationship with the armed forces is a complex issue full of all manner of complexities and questions that's got a lot to do with the very questionable relationship between Christianity and violence over the last 2,000 years. What I would suggest is that in the very early days of Christianity, non-violence was essential to the way Christians understood their faith. Non-violence isn't just about avoiding violence. It certainly isn't about passivity or avoiding conflict. It's about standing up to violence and actively living out our lives in a different way. If we look at the way Jesus lived and what he taught, I suggest that he understood active non-violence long before that term was coined. For example, when he said, if somebody hits you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. He was addressing people who were used to being hit, because he says if someone slaps you on the right cheek, the only way you can hit the right cheek with the right hand is if you give somebody a backhanded slap. This wasn't a fight between equals. A backhanded slap was the way in which slave owners disciplined their slaves. It was the way in which husbands abused their wives, and in which Roman soldiers put Jewish civilians in their place. When Jesus says turn the other cheek, he's telling them not to engage in violence in return, but nor to cower backwards in submission, but to assert their dignity in the face of an aggressor with more power than them by calmly turning the other cheek and letting their master or husband or the soldier know that he has failed in his attempt to humiliate them. Unfortunately, Christianity's relationship with violence changed over time. In the 4th century, the Roman Empire domesticated Christianity as what it found the best way of controlling it. And then we had a period of Christendom in which Christianity became allied with political and cultural power. Throughout Christendom, there was this awkward tension between Christianity's supposed commitment to peace and the endorsement of war and violence that came with Christianity's new power status. Christendom's in decline now in many countries, including Britain. We're a more multicultural society. Christianity is no longer at the centre of power, and I suggest that this is something that Christians should welcome, because Jesus never taught his followers to claim power and privileges for themselves that were denied to others. And if we're no longer at the centre of power, we can look more radically and more freshly at the teachings of Jesus again and seek to apply them in a way where we live and campaign in a way that is an example, rather than imposing our teachings on others. But the legacy of Christendom hangs over us like an unexorcised demon. We've still got various anomalies, such as bishops in the House of Lords and so on. And one of these anomalies is military chaplaincy. I think it's really important that members of the armed forces have chaplains. Members of the armed forces face death and danger, unimaginable things that most of us could barely get our heads around, and they need pastoral support. But the problem is that military chaplains are themselves part of the armed forces. They take ranks, they're subject to military discipline to some extent, they can't criticise the armed forces. They're rather like embedded journalists in that they don't have that independence. And that's problematic when their first loyalty is to Christ, because that loyalty and independence has been compromised. I'm not questioning the integrity or devoutness of military chaplains, many of whom do a great job. But the system, I suggest, is a legacy of Christendom, and it compromises our ability to speak out for peace and justice and for the values that Jesus taught. To give you an example, the Methodist Church has been really heroic, really brilliant in speaking out against nuclear weapons, and particularly against the renewal of the Trident nuclear missile system. Methodist Church has been not only one of the faith groups at the forefront of that, but one of the groups most at the forefront of that campaign. But I think that the Methodist Church, their own campaign against nuclear weapons, has been undermined this year by their big celebrations around 150 years of Methodist military chaplaincy. And they've produced a glossy booklet about that, which gives virtually no indication that there are any ethical complexities involved. How much better would it be if the Methodist Church, instead of trying to split off its chaplaincy celebrations from the ethics it applies the rest of the time, were to say that if nuclear weapons were deployed, Methodist chaplains would encourage British soldiers to refuse to obey orders to deploy them? That would be a heroic and a way of witnessing to the non-violence they generally seek to promote. So if we're going to live out our commitment to non-violence, live out the pastoral care, the provision of pastoral care which soldiers and others need, we need to do that from a place of independence and integrity. And that means facing the legacy of Christendom, recognising its severe limitations and turning again to the radical teachings of Christ.